What is to become of these men if the subscription fail before any plan can be adopted for their permanent support? The consequence of the National Constituent Assembly's decree of the 27th of November 1790, which required bishops and priests to take an oath confirming their acceptance of the new French constitution, which included the civil constitution of the clergy, were slow in process, but deeply significant in their impact. The new church order redrew traditional diocesan and parochial boundaries and incorporated the clergy in a renewed state. The planned ecclesiastical revolution was opposed so widely, but that by the summer of 1792, most of the bishops and many of the priests, probably more than half of the clergy of France, began to see exile rather than death or imprisonment as their inevitable fate. The September massacres of that year reinforced the urgency of emigration. Britain, despite its proudly Protestant identity, became a favoured destination with at least 3,000 French priests, mainly from Normandy and Brittany, landing in England's south coast in that month alone. Before the end of September 1792, an impressively supported committee under the chairmanship of John Wilmot, Member of Parliament for Coventry, began collecting charitable funds for the priests. The committee was inspired by Edmund Burke's printed appeal for the suffering clergy of France, refugees in the British dominions, which appeared in newspapers on the 18th of September and also appeared as a broadside. Burke's motives were self-avowedly political, but the committee reflected a humanitarian sympathy towards emigrants, or at least those perceived as right-thinking, already shown to the American Loyalist refugees, whose relief committee Wilmot also chaired. Most writers on the exile, including myself, have emphasized the positive side of émigré reception. There is another narrative. Guests who outstay their welcome, especially if they are perceived as demanding and expensive, are judged harshly by their faults, in this case, a potent combination of nationality and religion. The use of the clergy as living exemplars of the downside of revolution, as favoured by Burke, did not have a long life, especially as others saw them as being the justly banished representatives of a church which had actively persecuted Protestants. The question of what to do with them became urgent, and as voluntary contributions dried up, a hard-pressed state was forced to dig deep into its pockets. Even at the beginning of the emigration in 1792-3, within the context of the Aliens Act of 1793, the war with France, and a continuing resistance in government circles to Catholic emancipation, the hospitality shown to the émigré clergy was ambiguous. The necessity of some sort of containment was immediately attractive. The Aliens Act became law on the 8th of January 1793. Its intention was to prevent spies and other subversive elements posing as refugees. It was the first statutory control of immigration imposed by the British state, and the Royalist refugees, including the clergy, were closely monitored by the Alien Office, a subsidiary department of the Home Office, which continued to work until 1836. This is not the place to look in detail at this office, which has been viewed as the first effective modern British espionage agency. What is important here is its role in containment, which had become axiomatic in a state threatened by both internal and external enemies. Alongside the Alien Office was the idea of finding a suitable large building where the clergy could be placed under surveillance in a way which would not be possible if they were more widely dispersed. The idea of using a public building was floated by the first meeting of the Wilmot Committee on the 20th of September 1792, and a place was quickly offered by the government, the King's House at Winchester, a derelict royal residence adjacent to Winchester's historic castle, which had been used in the 1750s by French prisoners of war. and was quickly refitted for the clergy. By February 1793, over 200 French priests were in residence, and by 1796, when it was closed, it housed nearer 1,000. Direct supervision of the king's house was gentle. There were no warders, and the inmates were left largely to their own devices. The establishment was organized along the lines of a French seminary, with a clear set of rules and a tight daily timetable, which was difficult for the predominantly Breton and Norman country clergy, who were used to their own presbyteries and independence, but not harsh. Meals, simple and nourishing, were taken in common. A large chapel was provided for devotions, and a full range of spiritual and theological in-training provided. The success of the arrangements was shown in the few difficulties experienced in the locality, either with the local cathedral dignitaries or with the local citizens. Its purpose, as planned in 1792, was successful. It will add to their comfort and accommodation, London Chronicle declared. The religion of our country will run no hazard of being innovated upon by the tenets of Catholic priests. The consumption of provisions in the capital will be reduced. And of course, there will be less cause for murmur. And lastly, by dividing the good corn from the chaff, we shall the better know what description of Frenchmen remain among us. Another large public building, another former French prison at Fulton in Gosport, was also set aside to accommodate a further 250 priests, and this opened in October 1792, only to be closed in January 1793, as it was perceived as being in too sensitive a location, close to the Royal Naval Base at Portsmouth. Although other substantial buildings were provided in 1796 at Paddington, Reading, and Thame to rehouse the priests formerly at Winchester, the continued availability of such places was complicated by other more urgent calls on their use, and living in lodgings, either singly or in small groups, became the norm for the exiles. Supervision was principally vested in the French's own distributors of funds, who kept a close eye on the priests. The Winchester House became a barracks, but many other buildings were needed by an even more numerous group of French immigrants, the prisoners of war. By 1795, there were well over 13,000 prisoners. By 1814, more than 72,000, and perhaps 100,000 overall passed through the system. The billeting conditions were far harsher than those for the priests, and the numbers in any one place much greater. The great depot at Norman Cross in Huntingdonshire on the Great North Road was built for 7,000. Nothing on this scale was either planned or executed for the émigrés, but the numbers and needs of the prisoners of war were crucial in determining what was to be done with the priests. The whimsical play Les Émigrés au Théâtre Austral by citizen Gamas, performed in Paris on the 24th of November 1792, proposed Australia as the ideal place to send the émigrés, including clergy. The idea of relocating the clergy appealed to the British government, but Australia was not considered. Canada was the preferred option, although the Netherlands before the French conquest, Russia, and even Ireland were seen as possible locations. Burke was conscious that it would not be wise to accommodate the clergy for too long in the British Isles, as public opinion would turn against them. In Canada, the émigrés would be among their own countrymen, speaking the same language, having the same manners and the same religion. It was a suitably utilitarian scheme. It would help the émigrés, provide clergy for the priest-starved diocese of Quebec, and give a royalist transfusion to counter the republican and godless ideals seeping in from the newly independent United States. The Canadian plan was approved by Pitt in November 1792, and a public appeal launched in order to send the French clergy to Canada and establish them there. A fact-finding party led by Abbé Philippe Desjardins, a Norman vicar general, arrived in Quebec on the 7th of March 1793 and was well received. On the Canadian side, especially among Catholic Church officials, hopes were high. Less positive was the response to the French priests resident in Britain. They did not take kindly to the prospect of being shipped out to what they saw as a wilderness far from home. Their bishops were concerned that if too many accepted the invitation, there would be a shortage of priests when the return to France arrived. Colonial officials blew hot and cold about the loyalty of the French Canadians. In the event, no more than about 50 priests made the move, and although they made an important contribution, it was not until the 1840s that a more substantial movement of priests from France became possible. The Caribbean, much more volatile than Canada, provided a refuge for a number of French priests who began their exile in Britain. And it was French-speaking Martinique which attracted the greatest number. The great chronicler of Catholic Martinique, Bernard David, identified 32 priests who were émigrés in the Revolution on the island, most of whom traveled to the Caribbean via Britain. These included Jean-Baptiste Dubourg, who left England, where he had been since 1792, in 1795, Jean-Baptiste de Bouillé, who traveled from England in 1797 and went on to become Bishop of Poitiers from 1817 to 42, Guillaume Le Goff, who arrived as late as 1813 after many years at King's Lynn in Norfolk, and Matthew Benjamin Singer, who in 1797 was appointed chaplain to the British hospital on the island. As important as some of these individuals were in the development of the Catholic Church in the Caribbean, transportation on any reasonable scale to either Canada or the Caribbean did not prove a viable solution to what to do with so very great a number of priests. If not transportation, the threat of deportation always hung over the émigré clergy within the terms of the Aliens Act. And as the years of exile grew longer, the reality of forced return became more likely. The clergy themselves were keen on return to France, but at the right time. The effectiveness of the British authorities in enforcing deportation had been illustrated by what happened in Jersey. Given its proximity to France, Jersey received over 2,000 clergy by the beginning of 1793. But in 1796, it was decided on military grounds to evacuate the émigrés and land them in Britain. By March 1797, the number of priests had been reduced in Jersey to just over 250. This was a great precedent. And at various times in the late 1790s, the possibility of peace in France and even peace with France gave hope that the clergy could be repatriated. But the mass return took place in the opening years of the new century. Then depleted by death. In 1801-2, in the light of the Concordat for the French Church, numerous French clergy were repatriated, generally from either Portsmouth or Southampton on the south coast to Le Havre. Alphonse Martin, in his 1892 study of literature, lists hundreds by name. In 1803, the Aliens Act was tightened, and the London Catholic Vicar Apostolic, John Douglas, recorded in his diary on the 15th of October, 1803, the French priests remaining in London are obliged to appear every month before the magistrate at the police office and have their respective licenses to remain in England renewed or prolonged, or presumably cancelled. He had not yet heard that any French priests had been compelled to leave their situation. By 1803, when the threat of forced expulsion was immediate, most of the French priests had already returned to France. For a decade, the French émigré clergy in the British Isles had lived on borrowed time. In the closing months of 1793, the Pitt administration began to pay the French émigrés in Britain from government funds, and Wilmot's committee became an agent of the state. Lay émigrés were to be treated less generously than ecclesiastical ones, and if young enough, encouraged to join anti-revolutionary French forces, not an option for the clergy. Emigrant relief continued until 1815. Alternatives had been attempted, but small state pensions had proved to be the only system which worked. The Treasury had considered the whole of the sums given for the support of the clergy and laity as temporary, and only issued until some arrangement can be found for the disposal of the persons who are at present the objects of relief. No such solution to the problem of the French clergy had been found. And that's it.